Hi, I'm Lou and this is Lily Rowe, and today we're out on the lookout for the lovely hazel trees, or Corylus avellana, and we're looking at how do you identify a hazel tree in wintertime. We're going to be using our S.O.B.S acronym, which we explain more in our Introduction to Winter Tree ID video. We'll pop the link in the description below, but in summary, S.O.B.S stands for silhouette, outer bark, buds and twigs, and site or habitat. Do keep watching to the end, because we will also give you some ideas or tips around what you can use hazel for at Forest School, and also a bit about like the stories and folklore. So stay tuned. So we've just found a lovely little area with many hazel trees, and we thought we'd take a look at this one here. So firstly, it's silhouette. So hazel is naturally multi-stemmed. If you take a look at this one, it looks like there's several trees all together, but you can see they're all coming from a central point, and this is actually just one tree. It just naturally sends up lots of shoots. So you won't find hazel just one shoot on its own, unless it's a very, very young one that's recently been planted as a sapling. But generally speaking, they'll always be multi-stemmed. It kind of, because it's multi-stemmed, it kind of reaches out, so it will have a very broad rounding crown. It's naturally an understory species, which means it will never be one of the big kahunas of the woodland. It naturally occupies the shrub layer, so some people don't even consider like hazel a tree. It is a tree, but you know, they'll refer to it more as a shrub or a bush. You do also find it in hedgerows as well as woodland. So in a hedgerow, because of the hedgerow being cut, it might appear a very different shape, but you'll still find it. And if you traced it down to the bottom, it would still be multi-stemmed. Then moving on to the bark, hazel has a golden brownish bark. There is some variation, sometimes in tone. So often, like the younger stems, they can be a deeper shade of brown, or even sort of this one here is quite olive green in colour, and then the bigger diameter poles are more goldeny brown colour. There is a tendency sometimes for there to be a little bit of peeling, a little bit of flakiness of the bark. Not in every branch, but often in the younger ones in particular, there might be kind of quite peeling, a bit flaky, almost a bit birch-like, but not as much as birch. And you will also see lenticels visible, horizontal lenticels, which are these little raised bumps that tend to be paler than the bark colour itself, and lenticels are to do with gas exchange in the tree, but they are also a useful ID point. Then let's take a closer look at the buds and twigs, which is one of the most important ID features in winter. So hazel has an alternate bud arrangement, and this can be very prominent sometimes, to the extent of the young twigs almost having a bit of a zigzag on them as the buds come off in an alternate pattern. They range in colour from green through reddy tones to browny tones, so there is some variation in colour. Sometimes the buds might even have two tones to colour. It might be greeny on one side, and if you turn it over, reddy on another side. I've noticed they are quite rounded and quite plump, kind of well fed buds. plump buds, and they have got visible scales on them. You can see the bud scales on them. Sometimes you might notice a slightly darker edge to the bud scale as well. If you take a look at the twig, the young growth, the most recent growth of the twig, it tends to be quite hairy and sort of a green, olivey green colour through to browny colours. And again, sometimes in the young twigs you'll be able to see the very small pale lenticel spots on them too. At this time of year, which is the end of January coming into February, as you look at the buds, you might also be lucky enough to see the female flowers, which I'm very excited because I've I've spotted one on this twig, and this is one of my favourite flowers, the female flowers of the hazel. They look like tiny little sea anemones, and you'll see like there's a bud, but it's got like a little explosion of bright fuchsia pink, like little threads coming out of the end of the buds, and they're tiny but exquisite. They look like little sea anemones, and those are the female flowers. Yeah, female flowers with their threads out to catch the pollen on the wind, because it's a wind dispersing mechanism of seeds. In terms of site or habitat, you will find hazel in most soils. It perhaps favours fertile, well-drained soils, but it will grow pretty much anywhere apart from really waterlogged soils. It's particularly commonly found under oak canopy, so oak, birch, hazel, woodland is a sort of a habitat type. Yes, that you'll find it under. And as I mentioned before, you may also come across it in hedgerows. In terms of other ID features, there might be some other clues around to help you identify hazel. If we look on the ground, we might see some things left over from autumn. So there might be some leaves that I can see down here that would help us confirm it being hazel. Although there's a lot of other leaves in this woodland as well, but I can find an old hazel leaf, which actually still feels quite soft. Buzzard agrees. Also on the ground, you might come across hazelnut shells, either still intact if the squirrels haven't got them, or the halves from where the squirrels have broken them in half. So you might come across those as well as clues. And this time of year is also worth looking out for the male flowers on the trees as well. So we talked about the female flowers, like the little sea anemones, but the male flowers are these beautiful golden catkins that are full of pollen to disperse into the wind. So you'll see them, they start kind of quite tightly packed together, and then as winter moves on, sort of into end of January, February, they'll start to lengthen and they'll sort of open up, and that's how they release their pollen out. So hazels are monoecious, as in they have both male and female flowers separately but on the same tree. So these catkins are the male ones and the sea anemones are the female ones. And there's more, there's another female flower. They're so pretty. They are so pretty. Thinking about what we might confuse hazel with, there are a few species just to point out, because it's a because it's an understory species. There are other shrub-like species that you might come across. So for example, there's elder, which does sometimes also become multi-stemmed, but the silhouette of elder is much more gnarly, and it kind of like bends over and kind of has shoots coming off its back. It looks quite crone-like, like an old wise woman. The bark is also very different in elder. It's quite bobbly and greyer in colour, and it's got a very pithy middle. If you were to crack it open and have a look in the middle, a big pithy middle. The buds on elder are also opposite rather than the hazel's alternate, elder has very scruffy looking, sort of reddy purpley greeny buds. Then there's also elm to consider in the understory, which elm, because in the UK we suffered with Dutch elm disease, it's very rare to find a massive mature elm like there used to be many years ago. So the elms you do see are often quite small, and elm does naturally sucker. So again, you might see several stems of elm coming from the same spot. You might look at it in the winter and think it is hazel. It has fairly similar bark in terms of the lenticels and those markings. Elm also is an alternate bud pattern as well. So same alternate in hazel. But elm has got very small, very pointed, really dark coloured buds, and they're quite sharp almost when you feel them with your finger, really pointed and dark, and alternate. And it's sort of so alternate that it almost, like, sometimes the twigs of elm look like a TV aerial, because they're coming out almost at right angles as they come out of the main sort of central twig. So that's a key thing for elm to tell those apart, whereas the angle isn't so great on a hazel twig. There is also field maple. Particularly in hedgerows you might come across field maple. Field maple does grow into like a single stemmed bigger tree, but it's often kept in a hedgerow, or it might be cut or coppiced so that you might see it multi-stemmed. And field maple is it's a maple, so it's an opposite pattern again, so not alternate like hazel. And the bark can be very different in field maple. It can do this like crocodile back thing where it goes all kind of wibbly basically, so that would separate it out from hazel. And then finally there's sweet chestnut, which of course that normally is growing to be a big tree, but it does get coppiced, and when it's younger, again, you might look at it and think it could be hazel. The main differences there are sweet chestnut, particularly in younger growth, the bark is more olive green in colour. It does have white lenticels, white lenticels as well, and it is alternate in its bud patterns. The buds are quite rounded still in sweet chestnut, and they also are a similar colour in many ways, sort of greeny browny colour. But in sweet chestnut, the twig itself is quite angular, and it has this little shelf that the bud sits on top. I have made a video of sweet chestnut, so that's in the description below if you want to kind of check that out, because they can in winter be quite confusing if you get a young coppiced sweet chestnut compared to a hazel. In terms of wildlife and conservation, hazel is quite an important species. So historically it has been coppiced, which there's evidence that that's happened since the Neolithic time, where basically humans worked out that if you cut a broadleaf tree down, you don't kill it, it will send up lots of shoots, so it stimulates growth, and then instead of one big fat trunk you get lots of little thin trunks, which presumably, if you've got like flint axes, are a lot easier to cut down. So coppicing is a way of managing trees as a crop, if you like, as a sustainable crop. So hazel is particularly good at that, and because it's naturally self-coppicing, as in it's naturally multi-stemmed, it is like one of the most common species that will get coppiced. So historically humans have had a close connection with hazel and have used its wood for a lot of different things. So coppicing is usually done in rotation, which means one year a certain section of the woodland would get cut and then left, and then the following year a different section, and so on and so forth. And so that creates a mosaic of different habitats, which means there's more species that can live within that woodlands. So for example, when the trees have first been cut, there's a lot of light coming in that will reach the forest floor, and that's really good for plant species, wildflowers, insects, reptiles, things that need a lot of sunshine and warmth. Then as the shoots grow, it becomes kind of densely shrub-like thicket type habitat, great for nesting birds to kind of find a little cozy spot in there. Things like nightingales love it, and of course the hazel dormouse is also very reliant on hazel coppice habitat. Then as the trunks get fatter and bigger, things start to open out again, and then again that will be a habitat that suits another set of species. So altogether a coppice can be a really diverse place for wildlife. Thinking about hazel specifically, of course hazel also provides a food source for lots of creatures. So the nuts are well loved by all sorts of creatures, including humans. But the dormice, squirrels are very keen in this country and get them usually before anybody else. But also birds like jays and woodpeckers will have them too. The flowers are also an early food source for insects like bees, and when the leaves come out, they're nice and soft and a favourite of caterpillars, which of course then feed the birds, and so on and so forth. So a lovely complex food web will stem from a hazel tree. So I've had to start walking because Bubba was getting very grumpy with me standing still. So let's now think about the uses for hazel. And historically, hazel has been used for all sorts of things. So the wood grows very straight, and because it's coppiced, you can decide when to cut it depending on what diameter of pole you want, and it's very quick growing. So it's a fantastic resource for all sorts of things like broom handles, tool handles. They used to make hurdles with them because it's also very flexible wood. You can split them and weave them into those hurdles, like fence panel type things. You can also, from a forest school point of view, you can use the young growth to bend into hoops, make dream catchers, that sorts of things. Treat it in a similar way to willow for that kind of resource. It does split fairly easily, however there tends to always be a bit of a twist when you're splitting it, so that's something to be aware of, but it's a good thing to practice. It's a medium sort of hardness of wood for carving, but because it's usually in great supply, if you're coppicing it, it can be a great resource, for sort of green woodworking, carving, that kind of thing. You can make all sorts of things, and because it's often straight and you can find sections without too many knots in it, then that can be really beneficial. But I would recommend whittling it green to make it a lot easier. Just with any wood, it's easier to whittle it green. Because of it growing so straight, it's a great resource for things like tripod poles, shelter building poles, thin diameter stuff, maybe toasting sticks, frames for lashing picture frames together. When it's dry, it also has a beautiful resonance to it, so it's one of my favourite woods for making things like xylophones and mobiles out of, because it's got a really lovely sound. You can also make tapping sticks out of it too if you want to get musical. Its leaves are edible, best when young, but they are quite hairy, so it has a very interesting texture to it, but they are edible if push comes to shove. You might want to try them. And of course the hazelnuts are very tasty if you can get them before the squirrels. The squirrels tend to go for them before they're fully ripe, and so it can be quite challenging to find a hazelnut before a squirrel gets it. I've also at forest school found that the shells of the hazelnuts, after they've been eaten by the squirrels, you get like the little half shells. They can be a great resource as well. You can make little boats out of them, or for small world play, little hats for fairy creatures and all sorts of things like that. So they can be a great play resource too. And finally, in terms of folklore, because hazel is a native tree to the UK, there are all sorts of stories and beliefs and magic associated with it. It is one of the trees in the trioem, which is the tree calendar that goes back to Celtic times. It has also been used to divine water, where you find a Y stick of hazel, which is quite easy on hazel. There's usually a lot of Y sticks on hazel, and you hold it very loosely in your hands, and you kind of get into a very mindful state, and then you feel where it pulls you to find. Apparently it's not just water, it can be anything that you use to channel it, and hazel is kind of associated with kind of watery flowing energies, particularly in terms of its sort of energetic properties. One of the very well-known stories that involves the hazel tree is an Irish legend about the the sacred knowledge, basically. And there's a story that there was a sacred well, so you've got that water association again, and in the well lived a salmon, and around the well, this sacred water, there were a grove of 9 hazel trees, and they dropped their nuts into the water, and the salmon ate them. And then the salmon was caught by a wise man that had an apprentice who he asked him to prepare the salmon and to cook the salmon, but he told him he wasn't allowed to eat any of it, and because they were doing like a spell or something to make this wise man even wiser. And apparently there's different versions of the story, but when the young apprentice was cooking the salmon, he burnt himself, and it kind of sucked on his finger because he burnt himself, but he had some of the juices of the salmon on his finger, and he did that. So the magic spell that they were doing went to him, which was to convey all wisdom and all knowledge, and it went to the apprentice instead of the wise old man. So obviously he wasn't that wise. but that young apprentice became or is Finn McCall, which is an Irish folk hero who went on and had many adventures, and there are lots of folk tales about him. And apparently this is where we get the phrase "in a nutshell." So the idea that a hazelnut will contain all wisdom in a nutshell. So there's a fun fact for you. So now you know what to look for next time you're out. See how many hazel trees you can notice. If you're interested in more species, we've got a few more videos about winter tree ID. We'll pop the links in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video, do give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so you can join us again in the woods next time. And thanks for watching. Hazel buds alternate and round, early catkins and flowers may be found, multi-stemmed with hazelnut seeds, strong bendy wood, we give thanks, hazel trees.